There are lots of comments about them. I read enough of them to get a sense. So people want to understand like the development of the car and like its evolution over time, including the car before it, which I was going to talk about anyway.
Yeah,
But they want to know the changes that happened over the model run, how it drives. I would say those are the primary things. So
there's an interesting story about the Testarossa because, and I'm gonna ruin the surprise here, but just I want to hook our readers right off the bat. It doesn't drive anything like it looks. It's not the car you think it is.
Yes.
And I think that's something Derek and I have agreed on. The first time I ever drove a Testarossa, I was like, what's going on here? Because it's got what I call E31 phenomenon. E31 is the 8 series of the early 1990s. It looks like one thing, but it is something very different. So let's start from the beginning and talk about the BB.
yes.
Which is where the whole story starts. And I have my research, but I think your research is probably more better. So let's start with you, and then I can poke holes in your arguments and talk with you later.
All right. The BB, which people say stands for Berlinetta Boxer, but in fact does not. Go ahead.
Well, it's one of two things. We don't know what it actually stands for.
Mm-hmm.
We know it doesn't stand for Berlinetta Boxer. Ferrari has come out and said, so in traditional lore, 512BB, 512 was,
originally it was a 365.
Right, so Ferrari's naming convention back in the day was the number corresponded to the number of cubic centimeters of displacement for each cylinder. So this is 365 cc's times 12 is what, 4.4 liters or something.
Correct.
And that, so it was the 365BB, which the media decided stood for Berlinetta Boxer. Berlinetta meaning a coupe, and Boxer meaning a boxer engine. But the engine wasn't a boxer.
Correct. So in order for an engine to be a boxer, each cylinder, which is opposed to, or its opposing cylinder, they need to be on different crank throws. And in a V12 and in the 180 degree V12 in the boxer, they actually are the adjacent or opposite cylinders share the same crank throw, and so therefore it doesn't fit the technical definition of what a boxer motor is.
Correct. So you can call this either a 180 degree V12 or a flat 12.
Yes.
But the German term Boxermotor came from the fact that when opposing cylinders, as you said, had crank pins that were 180 degrees away from each other, and you looked at their motion, they did this, which to somebody at some point, probably a Porsche, resembled what the boxers resembled, and that's where that name came from. If these two opposing pistons, with the cylinders this way, share a crank pin, then they do this. They move in the same direction at the same time. So this is not a boxer, but it is a 180 degree V12, or a flat 12, which is pretty cool. But anyway, okay.
So yes, horizontally opposed. And that was Ferrari's first mid-engined 12-cylinder production car.
1971
3
production?
73, I think. And that was kind of a response to the Miura, because the Miura was his first mid-engine road car. Well, not technically, the Matra Jet was. But the Miura created
the supercar model.
Exactly. And so Ferrari's response, or their next flagship 12-cylinder car, was Daytona, which was a comparatively conventional car. It was a front-engine transaxle car. And everyone was like, oh, that's disappointing. Like, Ferrari didn't come out with a mid-engined car to respond to the Miura, which was such a sensation. So finally they did with the Boxer, initially the 365, which was carbureted, and that was replaced by the 512. The 512 for the first time was 5 liters, 12 cylinders, not 512 cc's per cylinder.
But
it's
hold
actually
on.
4.9
Wasn't there
liters.
weren't there like 3 different 365s?
No. Of the BB?
Yeah, I thought there was a 365 BB.
There were other 365s, but those were not the mid-engined cars.
Correct.
There was a 365 Daytona. There was a 365 GTC. There was a 365 GT4 2+2, which was the replacement of the GTC. Those are both 4-seat cars. But there was only one.
And
car.
that was a confusing part of Ferrari's nomenclature at the time. But because the V12 and the flat 12 shared 365 cc per cylinder displacement, it's very
there were a
tough.
bunch of 365 cars that
Right.
all look different from each other,
Right.
but share the same displacement, which is probably why they changed their methodology. So now the number will tell you what the car looks like, which it did not do at that period.
So they named it the BB, and so there are two internal stories that we've heard throughout history that explain what BB stands for. Neither is Berlinetta Boxer. The first one is that it stood for, you know the term, it means
No, I
twin
don't.
cam. Oh no, you didn't know this one? Hold on.
I remember you talking about it before, but I don't know what the term is.
So it means twin cam.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And the other one was Brigitte Bardot, the French actress. And that was as legend has it, when they were working on this project at Pininfarina, they said the curves reminded them of Brigitte Bardot. And so they started calling it the BB, but of course then Ferrari was like, well, we can't call a car after some celebrity. Can't name it
Particularly a French one.
Oui, bien sûr. So they sort of came up with the name, either Ferrari or the media came up with the name Berlinetta Boxer. But it could either be Bialbero, which is twin cam, or don't correct me if my Italian.
Bialbero. Oh yeah, okay.
Bialbero?
Albero, which is like tree, which is what you call camshaft in Italian.
Okay.
So yes. So that became the 512. The displacement grew half a liter to 4.9 liters. It was still carbureted. It has the same carburetors as Miura and also an early 911S, which are triple throat Webers. And then they switched to fuel injection. There were 929 carbureted Boxers built and 1,000 something injected ones built. And one of the things about that car is generally considered to be very beautiful. The car was never sold in the United States. They couldn't get it to pass emissions. So there are Boxers here now.
Right, it was strange that they couldn't get it to pass emissions, but independent companies could. That was kind of strange. So a lot of them actually wound up here.
Federalized
Yes. With who knows how many cats on it. Ferrari said it couldn't be done, but independents did.
Yes. So they all came over as gray market cars. And the radiator, like the Miura, the radiator was in the front, and then they had these pipes that brought coolant forward and aft along the length of the car so that they could have the radiator at the front with the airflow flowing in from the front of the car, which created some heat issues inside the cabin. And that was one of the primary reasons that they did this significant packaging change when the Testarossa came out.
Okay, hold on. Remember, I think it was last week we were talking about your boy David E. Davis and how you loved him so much and he was great. Well, I have a whole bunch of vintage car and drivers over here with all the road tests that they ever did of the Testarossa and a federalized, what year was this car? It was a federalized BB from a company called Amerispec.
Yeah,
and
they did more of them than anyone else.
Yep. And it was one of the harshest reviews I think I've read ever. It was just absolutely fucking mean. And Don Sherman wrote this. I'm pretty sure Don Sherman wrote this, who does not like me at all. We worked together briefly at Automobile. And I don't particularly care for Don, but he's right about a lot of things. And he said, blah, 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 he's bitching about everything. And he was, deep in my heart, I know that somewhere there's a wealthy Ferrari owner who shared this frustration and done the right thing about it. What one really needs to appreciate this car fully is a mirrored driveway. That's the only way to drive a Boxster without missing the best part, looking at it. But your boy, David E. Davis, slammed the shit out of this car. Blah, blah, blah. He was like comparing Ferraris went fast, they made great noise, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Well, the Ferrari will go plenty fast enough around corners in a straight line, but it won't do any of the things that a GM X car or a Ford Fairmont will do. And I hate it. My 30-year love affair with Ferraris had been based on the fact that Ferraris were exotic cars that made sense. They went fast and made wonderful noises and looked terrific, and you could still use one of them to pick up the dry cleaning. The Boxer breaks this useful rule, and I find that unforgivable. Here's my favorite part. If I wanted something useless for $100,000, I'd buy a bunch of congressmen. So was reading this last night going, and by the way, his whole counterpoint is scathing to that level. And I kind of love that they're all bitching about how hot it is in the cabin, how you have no chance of ever reaching the steering wheel because the top of the wheel is so far away, and that you can't see out of the friggin' thing. And I mean, they just all slammed the shit out of this car in ways that I can't, like, you just don't see today in journalism. And then you look at the specs, 5.0 to 60, which was really fast in 1981. This is June 81. But more impressively, 13.6 at 105 in the quarter mile. This, I mean, it was quick to 60, but first gear revved out to 64 miles an hour. So there's no shift. It was a long gear, and it still managed to get to 60 in 5 seconds. But 105 miles an hour to the quarter mile, like, holy shit, this car was fast. Okay, so...
I mean, so basically the complaints about the Boxer were that it was too much like a Miura. Because if any of that's, you know, you're reading all that, you're like, oh, it sounds a lot like a Miura. These are a lot of the things I dislike about the Miura. And these were the sort of issues with the mid-engine package. One of the things I think that made the third Italian mid-engine sort of halo car, the Maserati Bora, so good was that it was usable and civilized comparatively.
Right.
Now, the Boxer is a lot more civilized than the Miura, for sure.
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's also a lot more civilized than the Countach, which is just outright awful compared to either. In terms of like livability and practicality.
You say
and
awful.
usability.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, but the sad part is I actually disagree with David E. And then I think actually what makes for an awful daily driver when a car is new makes for a wonderful classic car when it gets old, because you really want an experience.
Yes, I totally agree with that.
And I can't fault David E. on that, because they're reviewing this as $100,000. By the way, $100,000 in 1981 was $300,000 today. So this, you know, was serious money, and they're looking at it as, well, this is a car that needs to work as a car, and we're looking at it now through the lens of history, saying this is a car that needs to be fun.
An experience.
Right.
Yes, it needs to feel special.
So I can't
which
really.
the Boxer does.
Yeah.
And so it was very hot inside, and so they moved the radiators to the back of the car. And in order to give them adequate airflow, they put them on the side of the car, which is why the car has those big vents on the side. Which
why the Testarossa.
The Testarossa, yes.
Right.
Sorry, when they transitioned from the Boxer to the Testarossa, they moved the radiators aft so that they didn't have to be piping hot coolant around the occupants and thereby cooking them. And so they put two radiators on the car, one on each side, and then they put the strakes on the side, the cheese graters, or whatever you want to call them, cheese slicers, because large openings were illegal in a lot of countries. So they put
especially
including the U.S.
Yeah. So
That was the other thing about the Testarossa, was that it was meant to be a car that was going to be able to be sold in the U.S. market, because the U.S. market had historically been Ferrari's biggest. And so the fact that they couldn't sell the Boxer, which was their flagship car, in the U.S. was quite problematic.
Right. So they, in 81? 83? What year? I don't remember when the Testarossa started.
84, it debuted in Paris.
Right. Oh, that's right. In 84, at a nightclub, the night before the Paris Auto Show, I remember the Lido bar. It was a bar. But they basically had to go back to the drawing board and fix these cooling problems, and also shift effort problems, and all kinds of other, like, sort of mid-engine. This is the early days of mid-engine cars. They had yet to really figure out how to make it work. So we had this in the 70s from the Ferrari. We had the 308s and the Dino, the 246 and 206. But that's kind of like, this is the gestation of the mid-engine car. So they had to figure out all these things, like getting all those coolant stuff to the back. And they...
Which is now like sort of de rigueur for a mid-engine car.
Well, they kind of, it depends on the car. I mean, Lotus Elise has all of its heat exchangers up front.
That's not a real car.
Okay, but even the 308, which has all of its cooling up front. The
Yeah, which
radiators
is from the 70s.
From the same era, but doesn't cook the passengers. So there were definitely, look, first of all, it's not a 5-liter V12 or flat 12. But also there were ways around this, but they chose their best way was to put the cooling in the back, which necessitated these huge intakes. And then
that's also what happened on the Countach. That's why the Countach has those big vents that stick up from the car, because they wanted to put the radiators into the airflow. So there's huge vents that are sort of on top of the Countach, almost on the tops of the fenders. are like that for a reason. You notice the prototype car doesn't have those because they were like, well, cooling, whatever, it's a concept. But then when they put them in production, the cars gained these huge vents.
Well, you know, and there are other solutions. Everyone's come up with other solutions now. All mid-engine cars have their radiators up front, including 911s. I mean, they're all just done that way. But at that point, their solution was to move the cooling system to the back, which necessitated, number one, widening the back so you can get sort of a triangle shape looked at from above to get airflow to them. And number two, then you have these big openings, and to pass crash, especially in the US, they had to put the strakes in. And if you read period pieces, they tried to hide them. And then at some point came up with this idea that, like, if it's a duck, and if, you know, quacks like a duck, whatever, just make it a fucking duck and just write duck on it. And that became this car.
It created one of the iconic calling card for the car.
Out of an engineering necessity, which I love.
Right, and the early reviews of the Testarossa are funny because they're like, oh, this thing is kind of funny looking, and like these awkward vents on the side, and like the car is so much wider in the back than the front, which remains an impression today. When you drive into Testarossa today, you're like, man, this thing is wide, and evidently it's the widest Ferrari ever made, in fact, that road car.
I mean, the scary part is that the rear is 6 inches wider than the front, which means
so
you
if
have
the front
to be
fits,
careful.
the back might not.
Yeah. Yep. Pulling out of the driveway, you're all fine until you're not. All right, so the Testarossa was actually a re-engineered version of the BB, but
4 valves per cylinder.
New engine,
Same basic engine, but with 4 valve, new heads.
See, that was another thing that I couldn't figure out. It looked like they had the same exact display.
시험 비행을 하고 있어야겠어.
이 새끼들 진짜 바보네.
왜?
내가 암만 병신이어도 I-153하고 1대1을 하진 않지.
I-153? 소련 거?
아, 소련형 걸렸는데 소련 포크리시킨이랑 I-153이랑 둘이서 뭉쳐다니면서 계속 나보고 너 왜 우리 쪽으로 안 오냐? 어? 이러거든? 근데
당연히 가면 안 돼. 도발이지 그거는.
어떤 병신이 절로 가.
그러니까 자살하겠다는 건데 그거는 에어브레이크.
니들이 꼴리면 오든가. 존나 어이없네.
아 여기 달려있는구나 에어브레이크.
꼬마 에어필드로 오시든가요.
슈퍼 터보 타죠. 라이트닝도 은근 빠르게 잘 도는데 겁나 빨라 씨 손에. 으악 차에 튀었다. 쉿. 아 데밋.
오케이, 이겼다.
끝났음?
I-153하고 폭격기 하나 남았는데,
어.
I-153만 어떻게 잘 잡으면 그럼 8킬 가능할 것 같아.
와. 인디펜던스 데이 데칼.
이게 왜 착륙이 안 되냐? 오이, 사람 죽을 일이구만.
고양이다.
아이, 뭐 어디 크게 맞았는데, 쟤?
홀리 쉣, 이름이 노무현이야. 으,
에?
일배충이구만. 일로
문제
와.
있네.
딱대. 젠장 사격각이 안 나와. 심지어 뒤에 미라주 붙었어. 안돼. 미라주가 맞았네. 개꿀. 잘가 미그 11. 고마워. 난 여길 빠져나가야겠어. 아니다. 잘하면 저거 실각이 나오나? 너 나한테 다시 오네? 튀어야지. 아 젠장할.
진짜 8킬 했네.
홀리 쉣. 고였구만. 혼자서 북치고 장구치고 다 하셨구만.